But life, of course, consists of final partings as well as first meetings.
I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow. To my darling Mama, as you begin your last great journey to join my dear late Papa, I want simply to say this: thank you.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis, back from a summer break. And Backstory now enters its 5th season. This is episode 1. What a week it's been here in the UK. In London, where I am, the Queen is lying in state at Westminster. The funeral to be attended by world leaders on Monday, September the 19th. The tears, the stories of past meetings, the lines of people waiting 8 hours now and walking miles to file past the coffin. It's all very moving, respectful, and there is a new king, King Charles III. On this Backstory, we'll talk about the future of the Commonwealth, and of course the Queen's reign and what she meant to so many. And Ukraine, a counter-offensive that seems to have shredded Putin's invasion force in the northeast. Ukrainian forces have the initiative as they reclaim towns and cities taken by Russia after the invasion in February. Jo Phillips is a commentator and has been a regular guest on Backstory. Welcome back, Jo. I mean, what a dark week for so many people.
Absolutely. And I think it has perhaps taken some of us by surprise, the level and depth of sentiment, not just amongst the public, but also from world leaders around the globe who've paid extraordinarily tributes to Her Majesty. I mean, not least of all, your own compatriot Justin Trudeau and France's Emmanuel Macron, who talked about she wasn't your queen, she was the queen. And I think, what you've got is this sense of this person who has been around for such a long time, who's seen so many presidents, prime ministers, leaders of multiple countries and faiths. And it's a bit of a shock, I think.
Why do I think that there's a lot more at play here, and I'll let you give your opinion on, than longevity? That she appealed to people on a lot of different levels.
Yes, I think part of it was because she was woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. So, her face was on our banknotes, on our coins. Pictures of the Queen were in every public building, from libraries to council offices to hospitals and what have you. And, any town in the country and around the world, will have got a plaque somewhere opened by Her Majesty the Queen. She was also, I think, the most photographed and filmed living person until her death last week, because she had been photographed when she was born and then constantly around the world on various tours and so on and so forth. So I think it was somebody, she was there, she was just ever present, but she was never sort of in your face. She was a constant and a calm presence, I suppose. Presidents come and go. We've seen Trump, we've seen Clinton, we've seen the Bushes. Here we've got prime ministers come and go. And she has just been there all the time. And I think what has come across is the great respect and regard that people had for the Queen, not least, closer to home, closer to the UK, in how she dealt with the Northern Ireland peace process. And the fact that when she went there, she wore an emerald green outfit, she shook hands with the Sinn Féin leader, Martin McGuinness, and all of those small gestures with so few words spoke volumes to so many people.
She's the Queen, so one would expect she had a healthy view of herself, but people say that didn't come across, that she was very focused in public appearances and anywhere that she went, whether it was a hospice or an opening of a a new school, or that she was very focused on giving to the people in front of her, and a completely neutral political character who just went out of her way in a very, even during Brexit, which was no easy navigation for her with Parliament deadlocked, she managed always to sidestep the political issues and stay very, very neutral during all of this.
Yeah, and I think that's why people hold her in such high regard. I mean, who knows what her real views were about Brexit or about Scottish independence? We can only guess. There's only rumour and speculation. Who can guess what she thought about the various heads of state that she's had to entertain at Buckingham Palace over the years for state banquets and great state occasions, and those people, who she's had to visit in the Commonwealth and elsewhere. But that thing about, saying little has really sort of borne out, I think, because we're so used to hearing everybody's opinions as soon as they've even been formed on Twitter and social media. And we know politicians are very quick to come out with their opinions. But in a way, that sort of mystery wrapped in an enigma made her much more powerful. So those little gestures, from the clothes she wore, the jewelry she wore, and as you say, she always went out of her way and recognised that people had gone to a lot of trouble. It meant a huge deal to them, whether they'd been queuing in the rain or, standing on aching feet, as I'm sure she used to put up with. But she had that beaming smile. She was a great giver to people, because I think she understood that people would remember their meeting with her or their encounter with her for the rest of their lives.
And a great unifying figure. Would you comment today, as we watched the casket leave Buckingham Palace, and then you saw the two princes, William and Harry, walking behind the King Charles, and Prince Harry wasn't in a uniform and wasn't allowed to wear his uniform. What's the dynamic at play then?
Who knows what the dynamic is? I mean, Harry, I feel, has brought this on himself. And it will be interesting to see whether his memoirs, which are due out next month, actually do come out. Because, like all families, there are tensions and there are rifts, and then, somebody marries somebody else, and, there's all of that sort of thing. I think there's no doubt that Harry, he has been a troubled soul, and I think he was very happy when he was in the army. He then met Meghan, decided to make a life in America. And has burned a lot of bridges, I think, with the royal family. I think his father, the king, has tried to extend an olive branch. He mentioned Harry and Meghan in his speech on the night of the Queen's death. But, you can't do this and stand united if you've got a bombshell autobiography or memoir coming out in a few weeks' time, laying bare or laying claim to things that were said, weren't said, might have been misinterpreted, because you just stir it all up again. And, you would think, wouldn't you, that actually now's the time to say, actually, I'm not going to publish.
Do you believe the printed reports that, in fact, King Charles asked them to come outside of Balmoral Castle, and that's when they did the walkabout, the two princes and their wife?
Yes, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I think, there's a point where, although it's a soap opera that is of interest to some people, this is an event of great magnitude. It has constitutional implications for the king. And actually, it's a time when you show unity. I mean, this is what people are supposed to do at funerals and during a period of mourning. And I'm quite sure that King Charles, as we have to get used to saying, would have said something either kindly or would have said, bang your heads together, for goodness sake. It's not about you. It's about your grandmother.
You obviously had a lot of respect for the Queen. Do you feel the same way about your king now?
No. Although I think that generally people have warmed to him over the years. I think, for him, it's very difficult, Dana. He's 73 years old. He's been waiting to do this job from the day he was born. So he's been the longest living apprentice in the world. for a job that only he can do. I think, people have seen more of him as the Queen's frailty became more apparent over the last couple of years, and the rest of the senior members of the royal family took on more of her duties. So I think people have warmed him, and I think, you could see that in the very warm reception that he got at the Platinum Jubilee back in the early summer. But I don't think people will feel the same, just simply because he's not the Queen, and the Queen came from a different age. And to a certain extent, we were brought up to respect the royal family. People who are now sort of youngsters, as King Charles succeeds to the throne, are not necessarily going to have that same backdrop of that sort of post-war deference.
Are you familiar with the term "the firm" when it applies to the royal family, and how do you break that down for us? Because there's quite an article in the New York Times today about King Charles, his finances and the taxes that he's avoided and the empire that he's built.
Yeah, and those things will continue to come and haunt him. There was, I think, a certain degree of deference towards the Queen, which is not going to be shown to Prince Charles, King Charles. The firm is what the royal family refer to themselves as, and the Queen always said, the firm comes first. In other words, it's that continuity, it's that sense of duty, above and beyond everything else, whether it's whatever's going on in your
So this
marriage.
Is not, when you hear the term "the firm," to me that sounds like the business environment of the royal family, the empire, the business empire.
No, I think you're thinking of succession. That's a totally different thing. No, I think it's much more about, this is an organization, if you like. I don't think it's so much about the finances and the business side of it, but I do think it is about the brand, if you like to put it in those sort of terms, even though it's not a sort of commercial thing. And, there are lots and lots of things that are going to happen in the next couple of years. All of those brands, whether they're dog biscuits or Wellington boots that were by royal appointment, will no longer have the right to have that crest within 2 years. So the King will have to decide who his suppliers are. And there are questions about the immense wealth, the income from the Duchy of Cornwall, the fact that he's not going to pay any tax on inheritance, and all of those things. And there is a sense, now may not be the time for people to voice it, but Thomas Keneally, the Australian Republican and writer, wrote a piece in The Guardian today, and it is a very articulate argument for republicanism. And I think Prince Charles, as he was not hugely popular. I think there were various revelations. I think people have largely forgiven him for Princess Diana, and Camilla, his now Queen Consort, is actually, I think, very well respected, and people feel warmly towards her. But I don't think he will have the same degree of public affection that his mother had.
So he gets a honeymoon period, especially now, because before he's the king, he is still just a son who is mourning the loss of his mother. But all of these debates, and some of them will be quite substantial, are to come, and will affect his image with the British public, especially in a recession when people can't afford heat at home. Things like, not being taxed on your inheritance in the millions of dollars. It'll be interesting how it plays out in the British public.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and in the Commonwealth. I mean, we know that there are several countries in the Commonwealth who want to have a referendum on independence quite soon. Australia has said they won't do it for a little while. But we do need to have the debate. And if we're not going to have it now during this period, because to a certain extent, the King is 73. In a way, he's a transition between his mother and that continuity towards his son, William, because clearly King Charles is not going to be on the throne for 70 years. So it's actually how he behaves and how he presents himself. I mean, he has spoken in the past of not living in Buckingham Palace, but opening it to the public. I think the fact that he and Camilla have done this sort of whistle-stop tour of the United Kingdom has done quite a lot to say, you know, the union of the United Kingdom is very, very important. And I think, you know, it's how he behaves. Again, probably how William and Kate, the new Prince and Princess of Wales, behave, and whether we see a sort of, if you like, a slimmed down royal family with, you know, far fewer hangers on. I mean, a lot of them have sort of disappeared over the years and have been slightly edged out. But you know, you've got to move quickly because, as you say, it's a honeymoon period and it won't last long. And once we get into the winter, with the cost of living crisis facing people, and of course, you know, very, very unfortunate timing that people who work at Clarence House were told yesterday that they might lose their jobs because the king
this was King Charles's residence, right?
That's right. Yeah. So that's his previous residence, which now is no longer. It may go to somebody else eventually.
Sorry, I interrupted you. They were told
that some of their jobs will be going. Now, you know, anybody would have advised anybody in any company around the world that wasn't the best timing.
Just wait.
Yeah, just wait. You know, don't do it because it just fuels that anger and that sense of, oh yes, it's all a pageant and it means nothing. I mean, you know, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there is a genuine affection for the Queen. I think there is a genuine respect for what she stood for. How long that will last remains to be seen.
Yeah. Well, and you can take the temperature of that just by watching people, you know, standing in line for hours and hours and hours, you know, in 4 and 5 mile lines around Westminster to go and view the coffin. So, Jo Phillips, thank you so much for guiding us through a little bit of this, and we appreciate your insight. All right, Nicolas Kenny is a professor of history at Simon Fraser University in Canada and British Columbia. Professor, first of all, you know, welcome, and can you give me an idea, how is this playing out in Canada as we speak? The first mourners are being allowed now to go and publicly view the casket of the Queen. I mean, they are very dark times nationally here.
Yeah, I mean, here in Canada, there's obviously been quite a surprising, I would say, outpouring of emotion. I think, I mean, the Queen was 96. It didn't come as any great surprise that she would pass away. But what I think nonetheless struck a lot of people is I think they were kind of surprised by their own emotional response to it. Now, just yesterday, the federal government announced that the day of the funeral next Monday would be a national holiday, and several provinces followed suit, including here in British Columbia, where I live, meaning the schools will be closed and well, provincial employees will have the day off. It doesn't quite extend to the private sector, but no, we're hearing all kinds of reminiscences about the Queen and of course the reflection of what she represents to Canada and more broadly what the monarchy represents for Canada.
Well, I mean, can we talk about that? Because I'm a bit confused historically in that the government of Pierre Elliott Trudeau brought home the Constitution. Where are we? 40 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And
exactly.
Essentially severing the constitutional tie to the monarchy. Now, did I go too far and say severing?
A little bit, because in a sense, although that repatriation or patriation of the Constitution was sort of the kind of final step in the full independence of Canada as a sovereign nation, we kept nevertheless an important symbolic role in the sense that we maintained the Queen as the head of state for the country, the head of state who purely a figurehead. This is purely a symbolic role, and it never ever went beyond that. A lot of people say, well, the de facto head of state is actually the governor general, and then within the provinces we have the lieutenant governors, and these are the people who are responsible for giving royal assent to laws that are passed. They do ceremonial tasks such as reading the speech from the throne at the beginning of a new legislative session, these kinds of things.
Right,
but these
as the Queen would
are
do
largely
here in
symbolic.
Parliament. The Queen would do the
Right.
speech from the throne. There in Canada, you had the Governor General, who, he would also dissolve Parliament when the parties came to him, and had the power to appoint a party to form a government as well.
That's correct, but only under the advice, according to the phrase, of the prime minister. And very, very rarely in history did a governor general ever take a decision independently from what the prime minister was recommending. So but it exists as a protective measure in case you do have a prime minister who goes off the rails or something like this. And we saw it come close. Well, in the kind of in the 1920s, but when Canada was still more attached colonially to the UK, we had Lord Byng, the Governor General, who refused to act on the advice of Mackenzie King. That's kind of ancient history, as it were. More recently, Michaël Jean, who was Governor General at the time that Stephen Harper was Premier, pushed back against his desire to prorogue Parliament, but ultimately acquiesced. It was quite an intense moment. Where I am in British Columbia, we actually had a lieutenant governor refused to dissolve Parliament on the grounds that there had just been an election, and the Premier didn't like the results and wanted to have a new election. The Governor General refused. So the role exists to.
Was he found to legally, just before you move on from that, was he found to legally have a right to do that? I mean, there's a Canadian Constitution that's completely independent of the United Kingdom and the monarchy.
Well, that's right, but these are the representatives of the monarch within Canada. So, in this case, the lieutenant governor, was appointed by the prime minister on the advice of the provincial premier, and there was debate at the time as to whether she could do this, but constitutional scholars weighed in, and ultimately it was an important precedent-setting moment. But I mean, these are very rare instances, but I evoke them to show that our political system, our system of governance, in fact, does depend on the existence of this institutional framework, right? So although it's a largely symbolic day-to-day job, the apparatus of governance in this country is built around that that Westminster parliamentary tradition.
So what happens now?
Right.
Certainly the popularity of the Queen may have put a damper on public debate about the future of the monarchy in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think now, under King Charles, once we get through this very hard 10 days of mourning, and then people start looking at King Charles, perhaps not with the same affection as they've had for Queen Elizabeth, that will fuel further debate about Canada's connection in the Commonwealth and to the monarchy in Britain?
Yeah, there's certainly polls that indicate that the affection for Elizabeth was much stronger than it is for Charles, and so there's two things. There's Elizabeth, the woman who was extraordinarily admired and appreciated by the population, and then there's the notion of the monarchy. And so a lot of people have indeed raised the question: did we keep that connection, that historical connection to the British crown, out of a sense of attachment to the Queen, and does that attachment to the monarchy outlive our affection, the country's affection for the Queen? So there's an interesting debate there. I think it will take time to develop. These are complicated questions that don't get sorted out, and that obviously surpass the individual. I mean, the crown is the crown, right? Whether it's Elizabeth or Charles, they are the person in that role, but the role stays the same. So you have to then ask yourself, or the country needs to ask itself, what do we do? And as I said before, our governance is structured around this institution, and so if you start to want to sever those ties, then you have to think about what do we replace this with, and certainly,
what would you replace it with? As a former crime reporter, former crime reporter who covered crown attorneys and the crown in the courts, and what do you replace it with? You just call it something else?
We still need some kind of head of state, and presumably we would maintain our parliamentary system. We wouldn't necessarily move to kind of a Republican style of government. That's not in our political traditions in this country. So you need to replace it with someone. Presumably you would keep that role of the governor general. The only thing is that would be a position that was existed only within Canada. That wasn't kind of a representative of the monarchy. We would have our own head of state, and a lot of countries around the world have a kind of a symbolic head of state, and then a head of government, which in our case is our prime minister in a de facto way that doesn't exist in the Constitution. So the problem, though, and this is the important point in all of this, is that there can be debate about what it looks like, but in Canada, we have a very difficult relationship with constitutional change. As you know, you referenced the patriation of the Constitution 40 years ago. That was a very divisive moment in a lot of ways in Canadian history, and it opened the door to 20 years of constitutional drama in this country. You'll recall the Meech Lake Accords and the Charlottetown Accords.
Please don't mention the Meech Lake Accords.
Exactly, things that nobody wanted to hear about. Because when you start to open up the Constitution, then suddenly different groups in the country have claims to what they want that new Constitution to look like. And because of our federal nature, because of the vast territorial expanse and the cultural differences that exist within the country, because of our history with colonialism as well, it's very difficult for Canadians to agree on what a new constitution would look like. And that's why I think, we have since those
it sounds like that's why
we have a head in the
sand. To finish your sentence for you, that's why probably the federal government just wants all of this to go away.
I think so. I don't think any sitting federal government is going to be the one to push this agenda forward. This is if this happens, it's going to come from outside of the government, because it's a can of worms. It's a Pandora's box for any government.
So what do you think? If we move away from Canada into the broader Commonwealth of those 53 nations. Some of them are having much more intense debate than Canada is, for sure. Mm-hmm. Like Australia, I think it's fair to say. Do you think that organization, maybe splinter is a good word?
Yeah, well, we'll see. The thing about the Commonwealth is certainly Canada's not the only country having these conversations. As you say, Australia, several Caribbean nations as well. We saw Barbados last year sever their ties with the monarchy. So in fact, for Canada, there's models for how this can be done. The Commonwealth exists as this kind of voluntary organization. It's not it's not like the United Nations or anything like that. It's not it's not diplomatically. It's a soft power kind of structure that has if you look on their website, their priorities are environmental protection, favoring trade between member states,
which coincidentally the king has had a huge environmental push, and maybe that is something that he would try to build on with the Commonwealth.
Presumably. So it exists, and of course the Commonwealth Games that is sort of maybe the most visible element of what this organization does. So it could continue to exist for historical reasons, because countries are connected to this organization because of the kind of voluntary work that it does. And already it's shifted away. I mean, the Commonwealth was born out of what was used to be called the British Empire, with a very hierarchical relationship. The Britain was on top, and then the other Commonwealth nations were sort of subservient to the crown. And then over the 20th century, that became a more egalitarian organization that was not hierarchical, that was no longer it's not even called the British Commonwealth, it's just the Commonwealth. And it exists, it's for sort of diplomatic reasons, and for smaller countries to seek assistance from larger ones, and spread of democracy and all that. So I think in terms of those historical connections, I don't see the organization falling apart. That connection to the history of empire, I think, is more and more tenuous, especially since the legacy of that colonialism is questioned in so many places around the world.
Professor Kenny, if I can finish with you kind of where I began, and that is how this is playing. I was anchoring CTV National News a long time ago in the 90s when Princess Diana died. And I think I vastly underestimated the public response around the world. And I'm not sure I've completely defined in my own mind why people rallied to her, but certainly there was sympathy for her. There was a sense of injustice around how her life had played out. She was, a beautiful princess, and on and on. But the Queen, I think, is a different situation. And if you had to put your finger on kind of the number one button on why Canadians and the British, for that matter, identify with the Queen, what would you say? I mean, yeah, she was a great queen. She wasn't very controversial. Was there something more in your mind that really made that connection?
I think sheer longevity. She was around for so long in a stable way. She sort of embodied the sense of being very stoic and above the fray, and able to navigate through all the tumult of world events, but also a scandal within her own family. But mostly, through all that, she was always there. Most Canadians, just because we're talking about Canada, but most people who are somehow connected to the crown have never known any other monarch. And I think that is extraordinarily powerful. The sense of, in a world of change, and we know how politicians like to capitalize on change and an uncertainty. She represented a lot of stability, and I think that has a lot to do with that affection people have had.
Yeah, I mean, public school in Ontario, at Kettleby Public School, north of Toronto, we sang "God Save the Queen." Do they still sing it in school?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think very rarely do schools still sing "God Save the Queen," but some might on certain occasions for sure. But yeah, it's something generations of Canadians have grown up with.
Nicolas Kenny, a professor at Simon Fraser University. Thank you, Professor Kenny. It's really great to talk to you.
Thanks very much. It was a pleasure.
Paul Niland is a writer, commentator, a resident of Kyiv. He also runs Lifeline Ukraine, a charitable support crisis line for Army veterans. And we've spoken many times. Hi, Paul. How are you doing? You must be happily shocked, as many of us, to understand how successful this counterattack and strategy by the Ukrainian army has been in the Kharkiv region.
I was shocked by the speed of it. I was shocked by how fast they were able to move into the occupied areas in Kharkiv. But I'm not only pleased about the developments there, the progress that the Ukrainian army have been making, but I'm also quite pleased about what's been happening in the south as well. We have to remember there's two different fronts presently, and what's happening in Kherson is equally important, and there's been gains that have been made there in previous days as well. So yeah, all across the battlefield, there's good news for the Ukrainian armed forces.
So do you think that this deprives Putin's army of victory in Luhansk and Donetsk? Absolutely,
yeah. Some of the towns that have been retaken have been important railway hubs. And we know that that's one of the main means of Russian logistics. They use railways for transporting most of their ammunition. So having taken them back in the Kharkiv region, yeah, it certainly puts a dent in what Putin was hoping to do in capturing the rest of Donetsk and Lugansk that he hadn't previously taken in 2014. It really strikes a blow to that. But more, it strikes a blow to, I mean, we know that the morale amongst the Russian armed forces is already rock bottom anyway, but it strikes a blow to their psychology because, you know, as frontline troops are retreating, fleeing, you know, in haste, they're coming up against
running for their lives and leaving dozens and dozens of tanks and armored personnel carriers and artillery pieces, changing out of uniform. I mean, this was a serious rout.
A very, very serious route. Yeah, exactly. And what I was going to say is that when they're retreating, and they're meeting their colleagues who are supposed to be, you know, in the rear and shoring up the rear side, the panic is just going to be spread and manifest throughout the entire Russian army. And as well, again, if I link it back to what's happening in the south, you know, the Russians that are sitting there in Kherson, whether they're in Kherson city on the right bank or whether they're in Kherson Oblast closer to Crimea, they're also seeing that their comrades are being completely routed, and they know that that's coming for them next as well.
How do you read the change in rhetoric in Russia? Like, for instance, I'm reading today, Bogdan Bespalko, the member of the Council for Interethnic Relations under the president of the Russian Federation, speaks out on television saying for 2 months, Ukrainian armed forces and military equipment have been massing in the area. All Telegram channels have been writing about it. Where was our damn reconnaissance? All of their heads should be laying on Putin's desk, hacked off at the base. Of course, this is a tactical defeat, and I hope it'll be very sobering. I mean, we have not heard anything like that from Russian propaganda channels since this started back in February.
Yeah, but it's very interesting how that's phrased, though, Dana, the way that you just read it out. So their heads should be taken off and put in front of Putin. What they're deliberately trying to do is to avoid blaming Putin himself. But at the end, well, not at the end of the day, at the beginning of the day, at the beginning of this phase of the war, it was entirely Putin's decision. And the catastrophe that has followed since is Putin's responsibility. So, you know, it's interesting that they're trying to spin this away from blaming the top man himself. But yeah,
well, and there's a little bit of you know, there's a little bit of practice nuance in there for them too, right? Because if you speak against Putin in today's Russia, that's a pretty good guarantee that you're going to be picked up by the FSB or the security services at night and thrown into prison. So you criticize as much as you can, but you never quite attack President Putin himself. But it seems slowly to be turning that way.
Well, either thrown in prison or thrown out of a window, you know, of an 8th floor building or whatever it is. We see
been a few of them
commonly. It happens all the time. But I mean, what they did at the beginning of the war in Russia was they criminalized any criticism of the armed forces themselves, right? So, you know, they tried to paint this broad brush, and it's not just the criticism of Putin, but any criticism of the war effort. It supposedly lands people in jail. I read a statistic last week that something like 3,800 administrative cases have been opened against people who've complained against the war. Well, you know, 3,800 out of a population of 144 million. There's really not enough internal objection from the Russian population yet. And I think one of the reasons for that is because they simply don't know what the casualty count is. And there was a document that was released last week, which was from Russia's own finance ministry, which was...
This is on payments to families.
Exactly right, payments to families. And that, I think the number was 48,383 payments have been made already, and there's still many more being processed. And that was before or on the eve of the Kharkiv counteroffensive as well, which has obviously resulted in a lot more Russian deaths.
By the way, we don't know what the Ukrainian death toll is either. And the fact is, I mean, a lot of military analysts say that when you start advancing and counterattacking, you can suffer 4 to 5 times the number of casualties. So no doubt Ukraine paid a price, we don't know how high, for that counteroffensive.
That's actually one of the things that I refuse to touch on when I'm sharing news on social media. Reports of deaths of specific Ukrainian soldiers, but it's simply because many of them are my friends, and I just can't even contemplate it at the moment. In the final reckoning after the victory, that's when I'm going to be taking stock of that. But I can't let that blow me at the moment. I need to focus on the things that we can talk about that are positive, and those things include the delivery of heavy weapons that have enabled Ukraine's counteroffensive, the retaking of territory, the isolation of the pocket of troops that is in Kherson city. That's the kind of things that I want to talk about. But yeah, for certain, the losses on Ukraine's side are also going to be very, very heavy. And it was interesting to see, and ballsy as well. President Zelensky went to Izium today, to go and see the troops on the front line of a town that was just liberated days ago, right? And one of the things that they did there that was very poignant was they stood a minute's silence for those who have fallen. But I'll look at that. I'll look at that after this is all said and done.
Is there a sense of foreboding at times, because you see, with the advances on the battlefield by Ukraine, the Russians begin to get cornered in certain areas. And there is talk even that, in the south, that soon the Crimea may come under the long-range artillery of the Ukrainian army. I mean, you're talking about airfields, you're talking about the home of the Black Sea Fleet. The Russians can get very desperate very quickly, and then you have people like Dmitry Medvedev, who was the former president and prime minister, and he's President Putin's poodle on the Security Council. His rhetoric is always kind of off the charts, and some people say that it's alcohol induced at times. But I mean, he's talking about that this will bring World War III.
Yeah, I saw that as well. I mean, that's literally the best reaction to Medvedev, isn't it? Just to laugh at him, right? I mean, what World War III? The thing that people have to remember, and I was discussing actually an article on this escalation rhetoric earlier on today. What can Russia actually escalate with? How would they fight?
Nuclear weapons is the fear.
Well. Yeah, but I mean, the thing about the way that the Russian military command is structured with regard to issuing that order is that it's not just the choice of one man. It's not just the insane lunatic that is Vladimir Putin. He doesn't have sole authority to do this himself. He needs the buy-in of his generals, and they know, although it's always missing from the propaganda evening TV talk shows when they're talking about annihilating the United Kingdom, which is where you're sitting, and they're always talking about these kind of things.
Thank you for reminding me about that. Yeah. When they're talking about a nuclear tsunami of water covering the island, I heard that one.
Yeah, that's what they said, and that was 2 months ago. They said they threatened to do something like that. But what they always don't factor in or don't talk about is that there would be an immediate counter response. I mean, by going nuclear, Putin is going to ensure the destruction of Moscow and St. Petersburg and many Russian citizens at the same time. It's I mean, I grew up in the era when we were talking about MAD, mutually assured destruction, and that's what I always think about, and try to.
Yeah. But I mean, it may not be that, Paul, where there's a massive nuclear counterstrike, right? I mean, it may be that the West and NATO and America then starts doing conventional strikes inside Russia. But certainly, I mean, Rose Gottemuller, who I know very well, who was one of the chief arms negotiators under the START treaties, she has come out expressing fear that Russia could go nuclear, and that they continually, she's urging Western leaders continually to warn Moscow of what the potential costs of that would be if they dare to use something like that.
I mean, but that's what I'm saying. Like they already know in actual fact what the costs would be, but it's right to be reminding them that they should just never go there. But again, like if you look at the try to follow a chain of logic to get to that point, with Russia's land forces being routed again, hammered in the conventional conflict on the ground. One sec. How did that then lead to them, having justification for the use of nuclear weapons? It just doesn't. It doesn't. Yes, it's right to, as you say, keep reminding them of the consequences of this, but I just don't see it happening.
Well, I mean, let's pray you're completely right, and that we don't even have to contemplate something as, I mean, it's crazy as that. But tell me, where do you think that this goes from here? Is there a sense there that the Ukrainian army, which may be slowing down a little bit, I mean, you can't push on days and days and days without resting, refeeding your troops, refueling. No. Is there a sense that this is going to stall now for the winter, or do you think that we'll see even bigger cities fall in the south as the Ukrainian army has momentum now, and that maybe they may go after areas in the Donbass and even Crimea itself?
Yeah, I was reading a very good thread yesterday from Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, and he was talking about exactly that. Like, if your troops are pushing forward, the maximum that you can allow them to do that for is
I read the same
like 5 days. You saw the same one, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's, they've reached that point. They must be exhausted, and so it's right that they are resting them for a period of time before they recommence. When they re-engage, because of where they are geographically, it is going to be coming down towards the Donbass from the north, and also Ukrainian forces are prodding into the Donetsk and Lugansk areas as well.
Yeah. So and it's important. And I know you know this, but I think maybe a lot of other people do, that's not some vertical or lateral front line, that once you take the Kherson Oblast, then you start coming around, it's been described as kind of a left-wheeling wagon wheel, where you start coming around behind and trapping a lot of Russian forces, who, by the way, have been cut off by this long-range artillery, taking out bridges, cut off from refueling and food and support. So, I mean, indeed, it changes just not the Kherson area, but I mean the entire battlefield.
Yeah, so I mean, if you go back to Kherson, and that actually links back to the last question that you were asking as well about Crimea. Crimea has already seen several attacks there. The Saki Air Force Base being the biggest one, obviously. But yeah, once Kherson has been liberated, then yes, very much Crimea is in play, and it is within range of the HIMARS and Crabs and Caesars, the heavy weapons that we've received from the US and Poland and France, respectively, and very much the return of Crimea. It is a part of the stated war aims of Ukraine right now, and has been almost since the 24th of February, when this escalation came. It was okay. Everything, Minsk is obviously dead, and all bets are off, and everything is on the table. And returning all of Ukraine's territories, including the areas of Donbass that Russia occupied in 2014, and including the Crimean Peninsula, that is where this war ends. That is what is the ultimate objective, and it is absolutely right as well. There was an interesting thing, actually. Let me just tag this on. Sergei Aksyonov, the Kremlin-appointed head of Crimea, has said in recent days that there's going to be serious fines and punishments for people who are chanting Ukrainian patriotic slogans or singing Ukrainian songs in Crimea itself. And so, I saw that and I just went, I'm so grateful that he's confirming that there remains a great deal of patriotism for Ukraine on the peninsula, and that he's worried about it. And the other thing that shows that the Russians are very worried about the position of Crimea as well is that lots of military families are being moved out of the peninsula and back to Russia proper, Russia itself. So they know what's coming.
Last question to you. Do you think that this silences a lot of the criticism in the West from people who are saying that the economic price of this conflict is too high? Let's try to impose some kind of peace negotiation or settlement, that it's just a frozen conflict. It could go on for years, that this counteroffensive by the Ukrainians has shown that actually victory could be in sight.
Victory is in sight. I don't know how long it's going to take us to get to the finish line, but certainly victory is in sight because the Russians are collapsing everywhere, and they will continue to collapse. The other thing that Ukraine is able to do as well. I mean, we were talking about the rest in the Kharkov region because they had to, but Ukraine is able to pick which targets it wants to go after next, and so it immediately, with the success of Kharkiv, there were hits again on the bridge that isolates now the Russian troops in Kherson itself. Yesterday I believe it was, there were hits on the Russian base at an airfield just outside of Melitopol, which is in Zaporizhia Oblast as well. They can't sleep anywhere. So yes, the victory is in sight. Whether that shuts up certain parties who are complaining about the economic cost of supporting Ukraine or whatever. I think Ursula von der Leyen said it today with the First Lady, Ukraine's First Lady, in the European Parliament with her, that yes, there is a price to be paid in dollars, but the price that Ukraine pays is in lives. And I mean, you know what I do. I don't put a dollar value on a single human life. I think that is something that is, every life is priceless, and that's the cost that we're paying here. It's not about money. It's about liberating, because you asked as well about freezing the conflict and having a negotiated settlement. It's about liberating the people who are on these occupied territories, and this is something that we've been seeing over the last week, especially is how they're greeting the Ukrainian troops as they roll through their villages and come into their towns and cities. They're crying and they're hugging them and saying, "We've been waiting for you." Yeah. Everywhere that the Russians occupy, we are going to uncover more and more evidence of torture and war crimes in all of these places.
Paul Niland, great to talk to you, Paul. Thank you so much.
As always, thank you, Dana.
All right. And that's our backstory. Season 5 begins. Check out my newsletter for analysis on big news stories, danalewis.substack.com. I am Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.